"Oh, this isn't your car. Let's not embarrass yourself in front of everyone." Officer Daniel Brooks let out a short, dismissive laugh as he slowly circled the sleek Porsche, dragging his fingers across the hood as if inspecting stolen merchandise. He didn't lower his voice. He wanted people to hear. A small crowd had already begun to gather, drawn by the flashing patrol lights and the unmistakable tone of public humiliation. Brooks tilted his head, smirking, as he looked the black woman up and down with exaggerated skepticism. "Step out of the vehicle. Slowly. We both know how this usually ends." Two additional officers positioned themselves nearby, their posture tense but curious, as if waiting for confirmation of a story they had already decided was true. The woman stepped out calmly. No argument, no raised voice, just silence. Then the sound of approaching engines broke through the tension. Black SUVs. Government plates. Doors opening in perfect sequence. And suddenly the officer who had been so certain moments ago wasn't smiling anymore. Stay with this story until the end, because what happened next forced more than one badge to answer for what they assumed. Comment your city and local time below. And if stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing so you never miss the truth behind moments like these. Naomi Carter had learned a long time ago that silence often revealed more about a situation than words ever could. At 34 years old, she had built her life on discipline, observation, and the quiet confidence that came from surviving rooms where people had already decided who she was before she even spoke. Chicago had taught her that lesson early. Not gently, not gradually, but repeatedly. The late afternoon sky stretched pale blue above Lakeshore Drive as Naomi guided the metallic graphite Porsche 911 Turbo S through steady traffic. The vehicle moved with controlled power, its low engine hum barely audible inside the insulated cabin. The car was new, only 3 weeks since delivery, but Naomi did not drive it for attention. She drove it because she appreciated precision engineering, performance, reliability, intentional design. Every choice she made had purpose, including this one. The Porsche had cost $214,320 after customization. Slate gray exterior, black leather interior with subtle red stitching, ceramic composite brakes, adaptive sport suspension, a machine built for individuals who valued control. Control had always mattered to Naomi. Her reflection briefly caught in the rearview mirror as the car slowed near an intersection in Chicago's Gold Coast neighborhood. Tailored ivory blazer, minimal jewelry, hair straight falling neatly past her shoulders. Calm expression, focused eyes that missed very little. Most people who passed her on the sidewalk would not have guessed that Naomi Carter was the founder of a financial technology firm now valued at over $180 million. They would not have guessed she had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city, where her mother worked double shifts as a nurse's aide while her father repaired HVAC systems across neighborhoods that rarely looked like the ones Naomi now drove through. They would not have guessed how many meetings she had walked into where people assumed she was the assistant, or the intern, or simply in the wrong place. Years earlier, Naomi had made a quiet promise to herself. She would never allow someone else's assumptions to dictate the direction of her life. Her company, Carter Quant Solutions, specialized in forensic financial analytics, advanced algorithms capable of detecting patterns invisible to traditional audit systems. Banks had quietly begun adopting her software. Federal regulators had taken notice, and eventually so had the Department of Justice, which was precisely why Naomi's schedule today had been carefully structured. Her phone, resting on the center console, displayed a reminder 4:30 p.m. meeting with DOJ, Financial Crimes Division. Location confidential. The meeting itself was not unusual. Over the past 8 months, Naomi had assisted federal investigators in identifying irregular transaction flows tied to shell corporations operating across multiple states. The numbers involved were significant enough to trigger multi-agency cooperation. $2.3 billion had a way of getting attention. Naomi slowed as traffic thickened ahead. Pedestrians crossed confidently, coats shifting lightly in the spring wind. A cyclist passed on her left. Nothing appeared unusual. Nothing suggested the next 15 minutes would alter the professional trajectory of more than one individual present on this street. She tapped the steering wheel lightly as the navigation system adjusted her arrival time. 8 minutes early. Predictable. Punctuality had always been part of her reputation. As the Porsche rolled to a smooth stop at a red light, Naomi allowed herself a brief moment of stillness. Chicago's downtown architecture reflected across the windshield, steel glass ambition layered vertically against the skyline. She did not notice the patrol vehicle at first. It appeared in the rearview mirror as a flicker of blue light, then red, then both. The sound of a short, controlled siren followed, not urgent, but deliberate. The kind used when an officer wanted compliance, not speed. Naomi's eyes moved calmly to the mirror. Police cruiser. Directly behind her. Her first thought was procedural. Had she drifted slightly above the speed limit? Missed a signal, failed to yield quickly enough at a crosswalk. Her driving record was nearly immaculate. She valued predictability in all areas of life, including traffic laws. She activated her turn signal and guided the Porsche smoothly toward the curb once the light changed. The vehicle stopped parallel to a row of clean, stone-front buildings, their large windows reflecting both the flashing patrol lights and the curious glances of pedestrians passing by. Naomi placed the car in park, hands visible on the steering wheel. Window partially lowered, every motion measured. Experience had taught her that tone often set the direction of encounters long before words were exchanged. In the rearview mirror, she observed the officer exiting the cruiser. White male, early 40s, confident posture, measured stride, hand resting lightly near his belt, not aggressive but intentional. His expression suggested he had already formed an opinion before reaching her window. Officer Daniel Brooks had spent 14 years with the Chicago Police Department. His personnel file described him as proactive, detail-oriented, assertive in field situations. Other descriptions existed as well. Unofficial ones. Complaints that rarely advanced beyond internal review. Allegations that remained difficult to quantify. Patterns that were often dismissed as coincidence. But patterns rarely lied. Brooks approached the driver's side, slowly pausing briefly near the rear quarter panel of the Porsche. His gaze moved across the vehicle's polished surface, lingering slightly longer than necessary on the manufacturer's badge. Something in his expression shifted. Interest mixed with skepticism. The kind of skepticism that did not originate from traffic enforcement priorities. Naomi noticed the pause. She noticed everything. Brooks finally reached the window, lowering his head slightly as he looked inside. For a fraction of a second, neither spoke. City noise continued around them. Footsteps. Distant horns. Wind brushing against architectural glass. Then Brooks' eyes moved from Naomi's face to the interior of the car, then back again. His jaw shifted subtly. An evaluation taking place. "Afternoon," he said, voice neutral, but carrying an undercurrent difficult to miss. Naomi nodded politely. "Good afternoon, officer." Her tone remained steady, respectful, unemotional, professional. Brooks rested one hand lightly on the upper edge of the open window frame, leaning just enough to communicate control of the interaction. License and registration. A standard request. Nothing unusual. Naomi reached calmly into her leather document holder, retrieving both items without hesitation. She handed them to Brooks with measured precision, careful not to create sudden movements that might escalate unnecessary tension. Brooks accepted the documents slowly. His eyes dropped to the name, then returned to her face, then back again. The silence stretched slightly longer than protocol required. Behind him, two pedestrians slowed their pace, curiosity quietly drawing them into the moment. Brooks exhaled softly, then glanced once more at the Porsche. His gaze lingered, and something about that pause suggested this stop was about to become something more than routine. Naomi felt the shift immediately. Not fear, recognition. The same subtle change in atmosphere she had experienced many times before. Moments when questions were asked, not because answers were needed, but because doubt had already been chosen. Brooks handed back neither document. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing just enough to communicate suspicion that had not yet been verbalized. The late afternoon sunlight reflected sharply across the Porsche's sculpted hood. Passing reflections distorted briefly in the polished metal. Somewhere in the distance, another siren sounded faintly. Naomi's phone vibrated once on the center console. 4:28 p.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule. Brooks finally spoke again, and this time the tone carried something new, something heavier, something deliberate. "Mind telling me how you came into possession of this vehicle, Ms. Carter?" The wording was precise, calculated, and very far from routine procedure. Naomi met his gaze calmly. The question itself told her everything she needed to know. This was no longer a traffic stop. This was an assumption. And assumptions had consequences. The question did not come from curiosity. It came from certainty. Officer Daniel Brooks did not ask how Naomi Carter purchased the Porsche because he needed clarification. He asked because in his mind, the conclusion had already been reached, and now he simply wanted her to confirm the version of reality he had constructed before the conversation even began. Naomi did not answer immediately. Silence, she had learned, often forced people to reveal more than explanations ever could. Brooks tapped the registration lightly against the side of the window frame, glancing once more at the name printed clearly across the document. Naomi Carter. His eyes shifted back toward her face, searching for hesitation, for discomfort, for any visible sign that might validate the suspicion forming beneath the surface of his professional tone. Because this vehicle, Brooks continued gesturing toward the Porsche with an open palm, has been reported in several auto theft patterns we've been monitoring recently. The statement was vague enough to avoid immediate contradiction, but specific enough to sound authoritative to anyone listening nearby. Two pedestrians had now fully stopped on the sidewalk. A man in a navy windbreaker pretended to check his phone while subtly angling his camera toward the scene. A young woman holding a paper coffee cup slowed her pace, her attention clearly drawn to the quiet tension gathering beside the curb. Naomi observed the shift in atmosphere without moving her hands from the steering wheel. Her voice remained composed. "Officer, are you stating that my vehicle is listed as stolen?" Brooks did not respond directly. Instead, he circled slowly toward the rear of the Porsche, scanning the license plate with visible concentration. His radio crackled softly at his shoulder, but he did not respond to the incoming call. He was focused now. Focused in the way individuals often became when they believed they had discovered something significant. "I'm saying," Brooks replied after a moment, "that situations like this require verification. Situations like this." The phrasing was intentional, non-accusatory on the surface, loaded beneath. Naomi turned her head slightly, following his movement in the side mirror as he crouched near the rear bumper to examine the VIN plate visible through the lower windshield corner. The Porsche's polished surface reflected the movement of the small crowd forming behind the patrol vehicle. People sensed confrontation the way animals sensed approaching storms. Subtle shifts in tone, changes in posture, voices just slightly louder than necessary. Brooks stood again, dusting his palms lightly against his uniform pants, before returning to Naomi's window. His expression had tightened. Something in the interaction had moved beyond routine verification. "You said this vehicle is yours," Brooks stated, holding the registration between two fingers, as though the document itself were questionable. "Yes," Naomi replied calmly. "And you purchased it, when 3 weeks ago?" Brooks nodded slowly. "From which dealership?" "Porsche Gold Coast. Financed num." The single word seemed to land with unexpected weight. Brooks's jaw flexed slightly. "Paid in full." He studied her face again. Measured. Unhurried. "Occupation?" he asked. The question was no longer related to the vehicle. Naomi recognized the shift immediately. "Financial technology," she replied. Brooks's eyebrow lifted almost imperceptibly. "Tech," he repeated. A faint smirk appeared, disappearing almost as quickly as it came. Behind him, another patrol vehicle rolled slowly into position, its lights activating before the engine had fully stopped. Blue reflections danced across nearby storefront windows. The presence of additional officers altered the energy immediately. Authority often multiplied confidence. Brooks gestured subtly as Officer Melissa Grant exited the second cruiser, her expression neutral but attentive as she approached the scene. "What's the situation?" Grant asked quietly. Brooks did not lower his voice. "Possible stolen vehicle?" he replied, just loudly enough for bystanders to hear. The words traveled quickly through the small, gathering crowd. A man near the sidewalk leaned closer, whispering something to the woman beside him. Phones shifted upward, recording angles adjusted. Naomi remained still, hands visible, breathing steady. Grant's eyes moved briefly toward Naomi, then toward the Porsche. Her expression revealed no immediate judgment, but Brooks' tone had already begun shaping the narrative forming around the encounter. Ma'am Brooks continued, resting one hand lightly against the top edge of the window frame, step out of the vehicle. Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Am I being detained?" Brooks's lips pressed together for a fraction of a second. "I'm asking you to step out of the vehicle." The phrasing avoided legal specificity. Intentional ambiguity often created leverage. Naomi considered the moment carefully. Escalation rarely benefited anyone when cameras were already present. She released her seatbelt slowly and opened the door with controlled precision, stepping onto the pavement with quiet confidence. The afternoon air carried the faint scent of spring rain lingering from earlier in the day. Naomi stood upright beside the Porsche, maintaining respectful distance while preserving personal dignity, Grant observed quietly. Brooks circled once more around the vehicle, as though searching for inconsistencies not visible in documentation. "Pop the trunk," he instructed. Naomi pressed the key fob once. The rear compartment opened smoothly. Empty. Clean. Exactly as expected. Brooks glanced inside only briefly before closing it again, his movements now slightly sharper than before. When individuals became invested in a conclusion, contradictory evidence often created frustration rather than clarity. Grant spoke again, more softly this time. "Daniel," but Brooks raised a hand slightly, signaling that he remained in control of the interaction. He retrieved his radio. "Dispatch," he said, voice calm but firm. "Run full VIN verification on a gray Porsche 911 Turbo S plate number." He read the sequence slowly. Naomi listened quietly. Each procedural step layered the encounter with increasing public visibility. The crowd had grown to nearly a dozen observers now. Some pretended not to watch. Most made no effort to hide it. Humiliation did not require raised voices. It required implication, suggestion, public framing. Grant shifted her weight slightly, her gaze returning to Naomi. "You said you purchased it recently," she asked. "Yes. Do you have proof of purchase documentation in the glove compartment?" Grant nodded. Naomi retrieved the folder, slowly handing over the printed invoice bearing dealership letterhead transaction ID and confirmation of full payment. Grant scanned the document. Everything appeared legitimate, professional, verifiable. Brooks ended the radio transmission, his expression revealing neither confirmation nor dismissal. "We're going to take a closer look," he said. Naomi noticed the wording again. "We." Plural authority. Shared certainty. Brooks stepped back, gesturing subtly toward the curb behind Naomi. "Stand over there for a moment." The request was framed as temporary, but the implication was unmistakable. Distance created perception. Perception created narrative. Naomi complied without argument. She stepped aside, calmly aware that every movement was now part of a public record being captured on at least 6 separate mobile phones. Brooks's voice carried again, slightly louder now. "These situations happen more often than people think." The statement drifted deliberately into the hearing range of the growing audience. Grant remained silent, her expression unreadable. The flashing patrol lights reflected across the Porsche's curved body panels, distorting the image in rhythmic pulses of red and blue. Somewhere nearby, a car horn sounded briefly before falling silent again. Brooks folded his arms, the posture of someone fully convinced of their position. Naomi met his gaze once more, calm, unmoved, unwilling to surrender dignity to assumption. The tension thickened. Something about the encounter had shifted beyond procedure, beyond verification, beyond necessity. And somewhere deep beneath the surface of the moment, a line had already been crossed. The flashing lights did more than illuminate the street. They created a stage. And on that stage, every word spoken carried weight far beyond the moment itself. Officer Daniel Brooks seemed aware of it. His posture had shifted subtly since the second patrol vehicle arrived. His shoulders squared more firmly. His movements became slower, more deliberate, the kind of body language that suggested certainty, even when certainty had not yet been earned. Public attention had a way of reinforcing assumptions. Brooks glanced briefly toward the small but growing cluster of onlookers gathering along the sidewalk. Some stood openly recording. Others pretended to scroll through their phones while ensuring their cameras remained angled toward the unfolding interaction. He did not ask them to step back. He did not lower his voice. Instead, he allowed the scene to breathe. Allowed it to expand. These types of vehicles, Brooks said just loud enough for several bystanders to hear, are frequently involved in interstate fraud activity. The statement was technically vague, but the implication was sharp. Naomi stood near the curb, exactly where he had directed her the late afternoon sun, catching the soft ivory tone of her tailored blazer. Her posture remained upright, calm, hands relaxed at her sides. Control did not always require force. Sometimes control was simply the refusal to react. Officer Melissa Grant shifted slightly beside Brooks, her gaze moving once again between Naomi and the documentation in her hand. "The VIN matches the registration," Grant said quietly. Brooks nodded without looking at her. "That's one data point. He turned his attention back toward Naomi. You mentioned you purchased this vehicle outright, he continued. That's a significant transaction. The phrasing suggested skepticism rather than curiosity. Naomi met his eyes directly. Yes. Brooks tilted his head slightly. And you said you work in financial technology, yes. Can you be more specific? The question did not relate to vehicle ownership. It related to perceived plausibility. Naomi recognized the shift immediately. My company develops forensic financial analysis software, she replied evenly. Brooks's lips pressed together briefly. Forensic, he repeated, as though testing the word. Grant glanced again at the purchase documentation. Daniel, the paperwork appears legitimate, she said quietly. Brooks' expression did not change. Paperwork can be fabricated. The words were spoken with casual authority. Naomi felt the familiar tightening in the atmosphere, the subtle shift from verification toward justification. When individuals became invested in a conclusion, evidence often became secondary to narrative. Behind them, a third patrol vehicle slowed near the intersection, its lights activating as it approached. The quiet whir of its engine blended with the low murmur of bystanders exchanging observations. 3 police vehicles now lined the curb, a visual escalation, an unspoken signal to the crowd that something serious was taking place. A young man in a gray hoodie adjusted his camera angle slightly, whispering under his breath, "This doesn't look like a traffic stop." Another woman nodded, her eyes fixed on Naomi with an expression that blended concern and curiosity. Brooks gestured toward the Porsche again. "I'm going to need you to confirm where you were earlier today," he said. Naomi's brow lifted slightly. "I'm not sure I understand the relevance." Brooks's voice hardened subtly. "We're verifying ownership timeline." Grant shifted her weight again, her expression suggesting that the explanation was stretching procedural necessity. Naomi responded calmly. "I was at my office from 9 this morning until approximately 4:05 p.m. Brooks nodded slowly, as though filing the information into an internal structure of suspicion. And prior to today, the question extended beyond reasonable scope. Naomi noticed. So did Grant. Daniel Grant said again, this time more directly, "We have valid registration and matching VIN." Brooks exhaled slowly through his nose, then stepped closer toward Naomi, lowering his voice only slightly. "Ma'am, luxury vehicle theft rings frequently use legitimate documentation as cover." The implication was clear and deliberate. The bystanders did not miss it. Several exchanged glances. Phones remained raised. Naomi observed Brooks carefully. There was confidence in his tone, but also something else, a subtle rigidity, the kind that often appeared when individuals felt their authority might be questioned. Officer Naomi said calmly, "Are you suggesting I am part of a theft operation?" Brooks did not answer directly. "I'm suggesting inconsistencies require clarification." Grant looked toward him again. "There are no inconsistencies," she said quietly. Brooks's jaw shifted. He turned away briefly, scanning the vehicle once more, as though the polished metal might reveal information not present in the documentation already reviewed. Moments like this rarely hinged on facts alone. They hinged on perception, and perception had already begun forming among the growing audience. The flashing lights reflected across nearby storefront glass, creating rhythmic pulses of color that drew additional attention from pedestrians further down the block. A rideshare vehicle slowed noticeably before continuing through the intersection. A cyclist stopped completely at the corner, removing one earbud to better hear the exchange. Brooks spoke again, this time projecting his voice slightly more. "These vehicles don't typically end up in situations like this without reason. Situations like this." The phrase hung in the air, undefined, loaded. Grant's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Naomi remained composed, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. Dignity did not always announce itself loudly, sometimes it existed quietly, refusing to shrink under scrutiny. Brooks extended his hand slightly. "I'll need the keys." Naomi did not move immediately. "May I ask under what authority?" Brooks's gaze sharpened. "Verification procedure," Grant interjected gently. "We can visually inspect without seizing control of the vehicle." Brooks did not respond. Instead, he held Naomi's gaze steadily. The request was not about necessity. It was about dominance. Power dynamics rarely required explanation. Naomi considered the moment carefully. Escalation would not serve her purpose. She removed the key fob slowly and placed it in Brooks's open palm. The exchange did not go unnoticed by the crowd. Small gestures often communicated larger meanings. Brooks pressed the unlock button again, unnecessarily, as though reaffirming control over the situation. The Porsche's mirrors folded outward with mechanical precision. He circled the vehicle once more, crouching slightly to inspect the wheel wells, running his fingers lightly along the seam of the rear bumper, as though expecting to find evidence hidden beneath flawless craftsmanship. Grant stood beside Naomi now, quiet, observing. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said softly. Naomi nodded once. "I understand procedure." Grant's eyes lingered briefly on her expression. Something in Naomi's composure suggested familiarity with moments like this. Familiarity no one should have needed. Brooks returned key fob, still in his hand. "We're going to run a deeper system check," he said. Naomi felt the shift again. Time, delay. Public spectacle extended just slightly longer. Behind Brooks, the small crowd had grown to nearly 20 observers now. A subtle ripple of whispers moved through them. Speculation spreading faster than facts ever could. Brooks lifted his radio again. "Dispatch, confirm any interstate alerts associated with this VIN." Static responded. Then silence. The seconds stretched. Grant watched Brooks carefully. Naomi observed the crowd. Every camera lens, every raised eyebrow, every quiet assumption forming in real time. Moments like this rarely existed in isolation. They echoed, they repeated, they accumulated. And somewhere beyond the intersection, a distant low rumble approached, too synchronized to be traffic, too measured to be coincidence. Naomi did not look toward the sound immediately, but she recognized the rhythm. Precision timing had always been part of her world. Brooks continued studying the Porsche, certain, focused, unaware that the narrative he believed he controlled was already beginning to change. The longer the scene lasted, the more the atmosphere began to shift from routine procedure into something performative. Officer Daniel Brooks no longer seemed interested in quiet verification. His voice carried farther now, each word carefully measured to sound authoritative to the growing number of people recording from the sidewalk. Authority, after all, was not only exercised, it was displayed. "You'd be surprised how often we see vehicles like this being used in identity fraud," Brooks said, pacing slowly around the Porsche as though narrating a case study for the audience behind him. "High-value assets, clean documentation, temporary possession, temporary possession." The phrase was chosen deliberately, a suggestion without accusation, an implication without evidence. Naomi remained standing exactly where she had been instructed. Her posture upright, shoulders relaxed, hands visible. The late afternoon sunlight reflected softly against the structured lines of her ivory blazer, highlighting the stillness of someone who understood that reacting emotionally would only feed the assumptions already taking shape around her. Grant's eyes moved between Brooks and Naomi, her expression increasingly difficult to interpret. "Daniel," she said quietly, "we have confirmation pending from dispatch." Brooks nodded absently, not breaking his slow inspection of the Porsche's exterior. "And until we receive it," he replied, "we continue verification." The crowd had grown to nearly 30 observers now. A delivery driver stood beside his parked van, openly recording. Two teenagers whispered near the corner, their phones angled discreetly but unmistakably toward Naomi. Public curiosity had transformed into collective anticipation. Moments involving power imbalance often drew attention faster than any emergency. Brooks stopped near the driver's door again, resting one hand lightly against the roof. "You said you purchased this outright?" He repeated, his voice carrying clearly across the sidewalk. "Yes," Naomi replied calmly. "With no financing." "Yes." Brooks tilted his head, studying her expression as though expecting hesitation to appear under sustained pressure. "Cash purchase, wire transfer." The response was precise, professional, unemotional. Brooks's lips curved slightly. "That's a significant liquidity position." The phrasing sounded almost academic, but the tone carried something else. Doubt disguised as curiosity. Behind Brooks, one of the bystanders shifted closer, whispering quietly to the person beside him. "You think it's actually stolen?" Another voice replied softly, "I don't know. Seems serious if 3 units are here." Perception spread quickly when authority framed a narrative. Grant stepped slightly closer to Brooks. "We have a clean preliminary VIN match," she said under her breath. Brooks did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked again at Naomi's watch, then at her shoes, then at the Porsche, patterns forming where none necessarily existed. "Step a little further back from the vehicle," Brooks instructed. Naomi complied without comment, moving 2 steps toward the curb. Distance again. Visual separation. The optics of suspicion often mattered more than the facts behind it. Brooks raised his voice slightly. "Vehicle theft operations frequently involve short-term possession to avoid detection." The comment was not directed at Naomi. It was directed at the audience. Grant's jaw tightened subtly. Her discomfort remained professional, controlled, but visible to anyone paying attention. Naomi spoke calmly. "Officer, I have provided registration, purchase, documentation, and identification." Brooks nodded. "And we're reviewing it." The phrasing stretched the process further. Grant glanced again toward the crowd. More phones now. At least 2 individuals had begun streaming live. Brooks seemed aware, and perhaps even encouraged by the visibility. He gestured toward the interior of the Porsche. "Open the glove compartment again." Naomi did. Brooks leaned inside, slightly scanning the contents without touching anything. Insurance documentation, owner's manual, dealer packet, everything orderly, everything consistent, everything normal. He stepped back slowly. "Sometimes individuals temporarily assume identities to facilitate asset movement," Brooks continued. The statement floated into the crowd like a suggestion waiting to be believed. Naomi felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not fear, recognition. She had seen moments like this before. Different environments, different assumptions. Same pattern. Her success had never fully insulated her from perception. Brooks folded his arms. "You understand our concern." It was not phrased as a question. Naomi met his gaze evenly. "I understand assumptions can sometimes create unnecessary situations." A few bystanders exchanged looks. Grant suppressed the faintest shift in expression. Brooks' jaw flexed, subtle tension now visible along the edges of his composure. He reached for his radio again. "Dispatch, confirm whether this VIN has any interstate flags." Static responded. The delay stretched the moment longer. Prolonged uncertainty fed narrative. Behind Brooks, One of the younger officers, who had arrived earlier, shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Naomi and the documentation still in Grant's hands. "This seems pretty straightforward," the officer murmured quietly. Brooks did not respond. Instead, he spoke again, his voice measured but louder than necessary. "These cases often appear straightforward at first." The implication lingered heavily in the air. Naomi felt multiple camera lenses focused on her face. Her expression did not change. Dignity did not require performance. Grant lowered her voice slightly. "Daniel, we are approaching procedural boundary." Brooks' gaze hardened almost imperceptibly. "Verification is procedure." Grant did not argue further, but her silence communicated unease. The crowd now filled nearly half the block. A pedestrian paused mid-step, whispering to her companion, "Something's definitely wrong." Another voice responded, "That car's like $200,000. Value influenced perception. Perception influenced assumption." Brooks stepped closer again, his shadow falling partially across Naomi's shoes. "Do you have proof of income consistent with this purchase?" The question crossed a line. Grant looked at him immediately. "That's not relevant to the stop," she said quietly. Brooks did not respond directly. Instead, he continued watching Naomi's face, waiting for reaction, for frustration, for resistance, any sign that would justify extending the encounter. Naomi remained composed. "My financial records are not subject to roadside review." The statement was calm, professional, firm. Several bystanders murmured softly. The balance of the interaction was shifting. Authority remained present, but confidence was no longer unilateral. Brooks exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the key fob still in his hand. Small gestures often revealed internal pressure. Grant's radio crackled softly. "Unit confirmation pending," a dispatcher's voice stated faintly. The delay continued, stretching the public spectacle. Time in moments like this often became part of the power dynamic. Every additional minute reinforced implication, reinforced doubt, reinforced narrative. Naomi stood quietly, aware that every second was being recorded from multiple angles. What would be remembered later would not be the paperwork. It would be the optics, the tone, the assumptions made visible. Somewhere down the street, the low, synchronized rumble Naomi had noticed earlier grew slightly louder, still distant, still subtle, but unmistakably coordinated. Brooks continued studying the Porsche, confident that time remained on his side. He did not yet realize that the moment he believed he controlled was approaching its turning point. The street had grown noticeably quieter, not because the city had slowed, but because attention had narrowed. Nearly 40 people now stood within viewing distance of the stop. Some kept a respectful distance. Others edged closer with the careful curiosity of individuals who sensed something unusual unfolding, but did not yet understand why. Officer Daniel Brooks remained focused on the Porsche, as though the vehicle itself might confess under prolonged scrutiny. He circled once more, slower this time, running his eyes along the body lines, the flawless paint, the precision engineering that reflected careful ownership. Everything about the car signaled legitimacy. Everything except the story he had already begun telling himself. Grant stood beside Naomi now, her stance neutral, her gaze observant. "Dispatch still confirming," Grant said quietly, glancing toward Brooks. Brooks nodded once, then spoke louder than necessary. "Sometimes stolen vehicles cycle through temporary holders before recovery." The statement drifted deliberately toward the crowd. Another implication. Another seed planted. Naomi's expression remained unchanged, her breathing steady, her posture relaxed but unyielding. Dignity often became most visible when challenged without justification. One of the younger officers near the third patrol vehicle shifted slightly, glancing toward Brooks before stepping closer. "Everything looks consistent so far," he said quietly. Brooks did not respond immediately. Instead, he crouched briefly near the front wheel, inspecting the brake calipers, as though irregularities might be hidden in plain sight. "Appearances can be deceiving," he said finally, rising slowly. Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The bystanders had grown quieter. Phones remained raised. Whispers moved carefully through the group. A middle-aged man in a tan jacket murmured softly to the woman beside him, "Why are they still holding her here?" Another voice responded, "They must think something's wrong." Narrative continued forming. Assumption continued spreading. Brooks turned back toward Naomi. "You mentioned financial technology," he said. "Yes. And your company is located where West Loop?" Brooks nodded slowly, as though cross-referencing invisible information. "And the business has been operating how long? 6 years. Number of employees." The questions had moved far beyond the scope of a traffic stop. Grant spoke again, this time with quiet firmness. "Daniel." He glanced briefly toward her, then back to Naomi. "Verification context," he replied. The phrasing had become familiar, elastic enough to stretch procedure beyond necessity. Naomi answered calmly. 72. Brooks lifted one eyebrow slightly. 72 employees. "Yes. And annual revenue." Grant stepped forward half a pace. "That's not relevant." Brooks exhaled through his nose, then turned slightly toward the crowd, scanning the faces watching. Authority often became performative when challenged. He shifted tone, more measured, more formal. "Ma'am, please step a little further toward the sidewalk." Naomi complied. 2 additional steps. Distance increasing again. Physical separation reinforcing visual implication. The Porsche now stood alone beside the curb, framed by flashing patrol lights. Symbolism rarely required explanation. Grant's radio crackled softly again. "VIN confirmation in progress, dispatch," repeated faintly. Still pending, still unresolved, still prolonging the moment. Naomi glanced briefly at her phone resting inside the vehicle. 4:31 p.m. 1 minute past schedule. She returned her attention to Brooks. "I have an appointment," she said calmly. Brooks nodded slightly. "This shouldn't take much longer." The phrase carried an implication of reassurance, but reassurance without justification often intensified unease rather than reducing it. One of the bystanders spoke quietly but audibly enough for several others nearby to hear. "She looks calm." Another voice replied, "I would not be calm." Calmness sometimes disrupted expectation. Expectation sometimes fueled suspicion. Brooks continued holding the key fob, turning it slowly between his fingers. Small gesture, subtle signal of control. "Do you frequently make high-value purchases like this?" he asked. Naomi paused briefly, then answered, "I make decisions consistent with my financial capacity." Grant suppressed the faintest exhale. The younger officer near the third patrol vehicle shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of questioning. Brooks's tone hardened slightly. "Verification often requires understanding financial behavior patterns." Grant stepped closer, now lowering her voice. "We have sufficient documentation." Brooks did not respond directly. Instead, he lifted his radio again. "Dispatch status on interstate database cross-reference static." Pause. Then still processing. Time continued stretching. Each additional minute layered the situation with increased public exposure. More phones, more recording, more interpretation. The sun dipped slightly lower behind the buildings, shadows lengthening across the polished surface of the Porsche. Reflections shifted as pedestrians slowed to observe. Some individuals pretended not to watch, but their steps slowed nonetheless. Brooks spoke again, projecting his voice outward slightly. These cases sometimes involve identity layering. Another implication, another suggestion of complexity where none had yet appeared. Naomi met his gaze calmly. "Officer, I have complied with every request." Brooks nodded. "And we appreciate cooperation." His tone suggested patience, but the structure of the encounter suggested persistence. Grant's eyes moved again toward the documentation folder. Everything aligned, everything confirmed, everything complete. Except Brooks' acceptance of it. One of the bystanders, a woman in business attire, spoke softly to the man beside her. "This feels unnecessary." The man nodded. Something's off. Perception continued shifting. Public observation often recalibrated authority faster than internal protocol. The younger officer stepped closer to Brooks again. "We have matching registration matching VIN purchase documentation." Brooks raised a hand slightly. "I understand." But his gaze remained fixed on Naomi, as though waiting for something to reveal itself. Something that would justify the duration of the stop. Something that would validate the narrative already spoken aloud. Grant's radio crackled again, then fell silent. The delay continued, but something else had begun to change. The low, synchronized engine sound Naomi had noticed earlier was now closer, distinct, coordinated, measured. The sound of multiple vehicles moving in controlled formation, still beyond the intersection, still unseen by most present, but approaching. Naomi recognized the rhythm immediately. Brooks did not. He remained focused on maintaining control of the interaction, unaware that the timeline he believed he dictated was already being rewritten. By now, the flashing lights had become part of the environment, an artificial heartbeat pulsing red and blue across polished metal glass storefronts, and the uneasy expressions of those watching from the sidewalk. The stop had lasted far longer than most traffic interactions. Long enough for tension to transform into spectacle. Officer Daniel Brooks stood facing Naomi Carter with the quiet certainty of someone convinced persistence would eventually produce confirmation. His posture remained controlled, but subtle signs of impatience had begun surfacing in the rhythm of his movements, the way he shifted his weight, the way the key fob tapped softly against his palm, the way his eyes searched for inconsistencies that refused to appear. Grant remained still beside Naomi, observing, calculating, carefully choosing when and whether to intervene again. "Dispatch confirmation is taking longer than expected," Brooks said, finally, his voice steady, but carrying a sharper edge now. Naomi nodded slightly. "I've provided all requested documentation." Brooks held her gaze. "And we're verifying that documentation." The words repeated. But repetition did not create evidence. The crowd had grown larger still. Nearly 50 people now lingered within view, drawn by the persistent presence of multiple patrol vehicles and the unmistakable signal that something unusual was unfolding. 2 individuals stood across the street, openly live streaming. Another person quietly narrated into their phone. 3 police cars. Luxury vehicle. Looks serious. Narratives formed quickly when authority framed suspicion publicly. Grant glanced toward Brooks. "We've exceeded standard stop duration," she said quietly. Brooks exhaled slowly through his nose. "Complex verifications require time." His gaze returned to Naomi. Please place your hands in front of you. The instruction landed with weight. Grant's eyes moved toward Brooks immediately. Daniel. He did not look at her. Temporary positioning. The phrasing attempted to soften the implication. But the implication remained unmistakable. Several bystanders shifted uncomfortably. One woman lowered her phone briefly, her expression tightening. Naomi did not immediately move. Her voice remained calm. "Am I under arrest?" Brooks tilted his head slightly. "I'm asking for cooperation. Ambiguity again. Control again. Optics again." Naomi extended her hand slowly in front of her body, not in surrender, but in visible compliance. The distinction mattered, even if few present fully recognized it. Grant's jaw tightened slightly. Her voice lowered. "This may not be necessary." Brooks' tone hardened almost imperceptibly. "We are ensuring control of the situation." The words carried further than intended. Or perhaps exactly as intended. The younger officer near the third patrol vehicle glanced toward Grant, uncertainty visible across his expression. One of the bystanders whispered audibly enough for those nearby to hear. "Why are they treating her like that?" Another voice responded softly. "They must think she stole the car." Assumption spreading, implication strengthening. Brooks reached toward his belt, not fully removing the handcuffs. Not yet, but allowing the metal to become visible. Symbolism rarely required explanation. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Phones rose higher, recording angles adjusted. Grant stepped slightly closer. "Daniel, documentation matches." Brooks did not respond. Instead, he addressed Naomi again. "Have you ever been investigated for financial irregularities?" The question extended far beyond reasonable scope. Naomi's eyes remained steady. "No." Brooks nodded slowly. "And your company has never been subject to regulatory review. All companies operating within federal jurisdiction are subject to review." The answer was precise. Professional. Unshaken. A faint murmur moved through the crowd. Grant's expression revealed increasing discomfort. "Daniel," she repeated quietly. Brooks's gaze did not shift. His confidence had become positional, entrenched. Authority often resisted retreat when exercised publicly. Naomi's phone vibrated softly inside the Porsche, 4:33 p.m. 3 minutes past schedule. Brooks noticed the vibration. His eyes flicked briefly toward the vehicle, then back to Naomi. Expecting someone, he asked. The question was casual, but carried an undercurrent. "Yes." "Who my legal counsel?" Grant exhaled slowly. Brooks' lips curved faintly. "Legal counsel." The phrase repeated as though confirming suspicion. Behind him, one of the live-streaming bystanders spoke quietly into their phone. "She just said lawyer." Another whisper responded. "This must be serious." Narratives layered quickly when partial information surfaced publicly. Grant crossed her arms lightly, still observing, still waiting, still evaluating the moment carefully. Brooks shifted his stance slightly. His shadow stretched longer across the pavement as the sun lowered behind the buildings. "You understand why this raises questions?" he said. Naomi did not respond immediately. "Then I understand why assumptions can create unnecessary escalation." The phrasing was careful, respectful, but unmistakably firm. The younger officer looked briefly toward Grant again. Grant gave no signal. Only silence. The low, synchronized rumble from down the street had grown louder now. Distinct. Measured. Multiple engines moving with controlled precision. Still just beyond view, but unmistakable to those accustomed to structured coordination. Naomi heard it clearly now. Brooks did not yet react. His focus remained fixed on maintaining positional authority. "I need verbal confirmation," Brooks continued, "that the vehicle has remained in your possession continuously since purchase." Naomi nodded. "Yes. No secondary operators. None. No storage transfers. None." The answers arrived without hesitation, without contradiction, without vulnerability. Grant's radio crackled again, then fell silent. No update yet. No resolution yet. Only prolonged uncertainty. The crowd remained still. Phones recording. Whispers circulating. Moments like this rarely disappeared quietly once documented publicly. Brooks's fingers tapped lightly against the metal edge of the handcuffs, still partially visible at his belt. A small movement, but a significant one. Symbolism mattered. Control mattered. Narrative mattered. Authority mattered. Naomi stood calmly, hands still visible in front of her, dignity intact, unshaken, unreduced. The rumble grew louder, now audible even to several bystanders. One man turned his head slightly toward the intersection. "That sounds official," he murmured. Grant noticed the shift first. Her eyes moved toward the end of the block. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Brooks followed her gaze, only briefly, then returned his attention to Naomi, still confident, still certain, still unaware that the assumptions shaping his decisions were about to collide with reality. The sound reached the intersection before the vehicles themselves appeared, low, controlled, synchronized. Not the erratic rush of emergency response, not the scattered movement of city traffic. This was coordinated, intentional, deliberate. Several bystanders turned simultaneously, drawn by the distinct rhythm of engines approaching in formation. The murmur within the crowd shifted subtly, curiosity blending with uncertainty, as 3 black SUVs turned onto the block in slow, precise sequence. Matte black, government plates, windows tinted dark enough to conceal identity, but not authority. The first SUV slowed near the perimeter of the police vehicles, then stopped. The second positioned itself behind it. The third remained slightly offset, creating a controlled triangle that altered the spatial dynamic of the entire street. Even before the engines powered down, the atmosphere changed. Authority had entered the scene, but not the kind currently holding Naomi beside the curb. Officer Daniel Brooks straightened instinctively, the subtle confidence in his posture tightening into something more rigid. His eyes moved from the vehicles to Naomi, then back again, as though searching for context he did not yet possess. Grant's expression sharpened immediately. Recognition. Professional instinct. Pattern awareness. Doors opened in near-perfect timing. 3 individuals stepped out, their attire unmistakably. Federal dark suits, earpieces, posture, suggesting operational coordination rather than casual presence. One of the agents moved toward Brooks first, his badge already visible in his hand. Gold seal. Department of Justice. Federal authority carried differently. It did not need raised voices. It did not need explanation. It simply occupied space and expected adjustment. "Who is in charge of this? Stop." The lead agent asked, his voice calm but precise. Brooks stepped forward slightly. "I am," he replied. The agent's eyes moved briefly toward Naomi, then toward the Porsche, then back to Brooks. On what basis? The question was simple, direct, unsoftened. Brooks shifted his weight slightly. Vehicle ownership verification. The agent's gaze held steady. Verification of what specifically Brooks gestured subtly toward the Porsche. Potential theft indicators. The phrase sounded less convincing now than it had minutes earlier. The agent extended his hand calmly. "I'll need your name and badge number." Brooks hesitated for a fraction of a second, then complied. Officer Melissa Grant remained silent beside Naomi, her posture now subtly repositioned, no longer fully aligned with Brooks's authority structure. The lead agent nodded once after glancing at Brooks's identification, then turned toward Naomi. "Ms. Carter, it was not a question. It was confirmation." Naomi inclined her head slightly. "Yes." "Apologies for the delay," the agent said quietly. The words did not go unnoticed by the crowd. Apologies implied context. Context implied significance. Brooks' brow tightened slightly. "You're familiar with this individual?" he asked. The agent's expression did not change. "Yes." A pause followed. Small, but heavy. Another agent stepped forward now, scanning the perimeter of the gathered bystanders, before speaking calmly into a communication device clipped discreetly near his collar. Perimeter confirmed. The phrasing carried operational weight. Brooks felt the shift. Authority had entered the interaction at a higher level. One of the SUVs repositioned, slightly narrowing the street's flow of traffic, a subtle containment, not aggressive, but unmistakable. The lead agent turned back toward Brooks. "This stop is interfering with an active federal timeline." The wording was careful, measured, but unmistakably corrective. Brooks's posture stiffened. "I'm conducting lawful verification," he replied. The agent nodded once. "I understand." "Then, we'll assume responsibility from here." The statement was not aggressive. It did not need to be. Authority layered above authority often required minimal explanation. Grant exhaled slowly beside Naomi, tension visibly shifting in her shoulders. The younger officer near the third patrol vehicle exchanged a glance with his partner. Uncertainty now moved through the police presence. Control had shifted. The lead agent turned once more toward Naomi. "Are you prepared to continue as scheduled?" Naomi nodded. "Yes." The second agent stepped forward, his tone neutral but precise. "The street will be temporarily restricted." He spoke into his communication device again. "Proceed." Within seconds, a fourth unmarked vehicle appeared at the far end of the block, positioning itself to prevent additional traffic from entering the immediate area. The crowd murmured audibly now. Phones remained raised. Recording continued. But the narrative had begun changing. A bystander whispered quietly, "Wait, DOJ." Another voice responded, "That's federal." Perception recalibrated quickly when authority restructured hierarchy. Brooks remained still. Processing. Reassessing. Recalculating. The assumptions that had fueled his persistence minutes earlier now encountered resistance from a structure beyond departmental jurisdiction. The lead agent returned his attention to Brooks. "I'll need confirmation of all actions taken during this stop." Brooks nodded slowly. "Standard procedure." The agent's gaze held steady. "We'll determine that." Grant looked briefly toward Naomi, then toward the agents, then back toward Brooks. The silence that followed carried more weight than any raised voice could have delivered. Brooks extended the key fob back toward Naomi. A small gesture, but one observed by every camera present. Naomi accepted it calmly. Dignity intact. Control restored. The flashing patrol lights still reflected across the Porsche's polished surface, but now those reflections blended with the darker silhouettes of federal vehicles positioned strategically along the street. Hierarchy had changed. Authority had shifted. Narrative had transformed. And the moment Officer Daniel Brooks believed he had fully understood, had only just begun revealing its true context. The street no longer felt like the same place. Minutes earlier, authority had radiated outward from 3 patrol vehicles and 1 officer's certainty. Now the geometry of power had shifted. Black SUVs stood in controlled positions along the curb, their presence quiet but decisive. The subtle choreography of federal procedure had begun unfolding, and even the bystanders sensed that the story they thought they were witnessing had just changed direction. Officer Daniel Brooks stood motionless for a brief moment, as if recalibrating an internal map that no longer aligned with the environment around him. The lead Department of Justice agent stepped slightly closer, his posture calm but unambiguous. "We have been coordinating with Ms. Carter for several months," he said evenly. The words landed carefully, publicly, intentionally. Brooks' jaw tightened. Grant's eyes shifted briefly toward Naomi, then back to the agent. The bystanders leaned forward almost collectively, as though drawn by gravity toward clarity. The agent continued, "Ms. Carter is a cooperating financial specialist assisting in an ongoing federal investigation involving interstate transaction concealment networks." The phrasing was precise, professional, but unmistakably significant. Brooks nodded once. Slowly, as though acknowledging information he wished he had possessed earlier. Investigation into what he asked, maintaining composure. The agent did not hesitate. Multi-layered financial laundering structures operating across multiple shell entities. Current exposure estimate, approximately $2.3 billion. The number traveled through the air like a pressure wave. $2.3 billion. Several bystanders exchanged startled glances. One man whispered audibly, "That's huge." Another voice murmured, "That's federal level." The younger officer near the 3rd patrol vehicle shifted uncomfortably, his posture no longer projecting the certainty visible minutes earlier. Brooks' expression remained controlled, but the slight tightening at the corner of his eyes revealed the internal shift taking place. The agent continued calmly. "Ms. Carter's firm developed algorithmic tracing methods capable of identifying transaction anomalies undetectable through conventional review systems." Grant's brow lifted slightly. Respect had entered her expression. Naomi remained composed, still, quiet. Professional, she did not speak. She did not perform vindication. She simply allowed the truth to occupy space. The lead agent turned slightly toward Brooks again. "This stop has created an unanticipated public complication." The phrasing remained diplomatic, but the implication was unmistakable. Brooks nodded once more. "I was not informed of any federal coordination connected to this individual." The agent inclined his head slightly. "That is correct." The answer did not relieve tension. It redirected it. Brooks exhaled slowly through his nose. Grant crossed her arms lightly, her gaze shifting between Brooks and the federal team. Another agent stepped forward, now holding a tablet displaying what appeared to be operational scheduling documentation. The timeline was structured to minimize public visibility, the agent stated quietly to the lead representative. The lead agent nodded once, then addressed Brooks again. "For clarity, Ms. Carter is scheduled to provide analytic consultation tied to evidentiary pattern correlation within an active DOJ case file." The formal phrasing carried legal weight. Precision mattered, particularly when documentation might later be reviewed in formal proceedings. Brooks glanced briefly toward Naomi, then back toward the Porsche, then toward the bystanders still recording. The narrative had fully inverted. Moments earlier, the public frame suggested suspicion. Now the frame suggested disruption of a federal process. Grant's voice remained low but steady. The documentation provided during the stop was valid. Brooks nodded once. Yes, the admission was quiet, but audible. The younger officer shifted again, glancing toward the federal vehicles positioned carefully at both ends of the block. Containment had not been aggressive, but it had been effective. The bystanders now whispered with a different tone. Curiosity remained, but speculation had transformed into recognition of significance. A woman near the front of the gathering spoke softly. "They shut down the street." Another voice replied, "For her." The lead agent addressed Naomi once more. "We are prepared to proceed whenever you are ready." Naomi inclined her head slightly. "Understood." Her tone remained measured, unemotional, professional. Brooks spoke again, his voice controlled but noticeably quieter. I was operating within procedural scope. The lead agent did not challenge the statement directly. Instead, we will review the sequence of events. Neutral phrasing, but unmistakable direction. Grant's gaze lowered briefly, then returned to neutral position. The federal agent holding the tablet spoke again softly. Timeline deviation, 12 minutes. The precision emphasized the operational impact. 12 minutes mattered in coordinated investigations, particularly when multiple agencies synchronized schedules across jurisdictions. The lead agent nodded once, then turned back toward Brooks. We will require body camera footage for documentation purposes, Brooks acknowledged with a slight nod. Understood. The younger officer glanced subtly toward Grant. Grant's expression remained composed. Professional neutrality, but her posture now aligned more closely with the federal presence than with Brooks' earlier authority structure. Naomi stepped calmly toward the Porsche, her movements unhurried. No visible satisfaction, no visible frustration, only continuity. She opened the driver's door, paused briefly, then turned back toward the lead agent. I assume discretion remains priority. The agent inclined his head slightly. Correct. The crowd's whispers softened as Naomi returned to the vehicle. Respect often manifested in silence rather than applause. Brooks watched quietly, processing, reassessing, understanding perhaps for the first time the magnitude of the assumption that had shaped his decisions. Moments earlier, he had been certain he was addressing a potential theft. Now he stood adjacent to a federal operation involving billions of dollars. Grant exhaled slowly beside him. The sound was almost imperceptible, but meaningful. Authority rarely enjoyed public recalibration, but recalibration had occurred nonetheless. The flashing patrol lights continued reflecting across the Porsche's polished surface. But now those reflections existed alongside something else: perspective, hierarchy, consequence, and the realization that some assumptions carried costs far greater than momentary embarrassment. The lead agent stepped back toward the SUV, speaking briefly into his communication device. The street remained controlled, contained, structured, but the direction of the narrative had fully changed. Officer Daniel Brooks now understood that the situation he believed he had clarified had in fact clarified him. The silence that followed felt heavier than the confrontation that had come before it. Moments earlier, Officer Daniel Brooks had controlled the pace of the interaction. Every question had carried authority. Every pause had reinforced assumption. Every glance from the crowd had strengthened the narrative he believed he understood. Now that narrative had shifted, and the shift was public. The lead Department of Justice agent spoke quietly with one of his colleagues beside the open rear door of the first black SUV. Their conversation remained low, professional, structured, but its existence alone signaled escalation beyond the street-level authority Brooks had relied upon only minutes earlier. Grant stood still, her posture composed, but her gaze now more observant than participatory. The younger officer near the third patrol vehicle avoided eye contact entirely, his attention fixed on an imaginary point somewhere near the pavement. Authority had not disappeared, but it had been rearranged. Officer Brooks, the lead agent, said calmly, stepping forward once more. Brooks turned immediately. Yes, we will require documentation of the initial basis for the stop. Brooks nodded slowly. Traffic observation irregularity, he replied. The phrasing sounded thinner now than it had earlier. Please specify, the agent said. Brooks inhaled once. The vehicle drew attention due to recent theft patterns involving high-value performance cars. The agent's expression remained neutral. And what specific indicator linked this vehicle to those patterns? The question was not confrontational, but it was precise. Precision often revealed gaps narrative could conceal. Brooks hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then behavioral indicators. Grant's eyes moved subtly toward him. The agent nodded once, making a brief notation on the tablet held by the second federal representative. Behavioral indicators, the agent repeated. A pause followed. Then, we will review the full sequence. The words landed softly, but the implication carried structural weight. Brooks's posture stiffened slightly. The crowd had quieted further. Phones remained raised, but the tone of observation had changed. Earlier curiosity had transformed into focused attention, the kind reserved for moments when authority itself became the subject. Naomi remained seated inside the Porsche, now hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, waiting patiently for the procedural transition to complete. She did not watch Brooks. She did not need to. Grant spoke carefully. All documentation provided during the stop matched registration records. The agent acknowledged the statement with a slight nod. "We appreciate the clarification." Brooks remained composed, but a faint tightening in his jaw suggested internal recalculation. The younger officer shifted his stance again, glancing briefly toward the federal vehicles before looking away. Public correction rarely required raised voices. It required visibility, structure, documentation. The lead agent spoke again. "We will also require body camera footage for internal review." Brooks nodded. "Understood." Grant's radio crackled softly at her shoulder dispatch, confirming full VIN clearance at last. Vehicle registration verified. No active alerts. The confirmation arrived too late to influence the outcome. Timing in moments like this often determined narrative weight. The agent glanced briefly toward Grant. "Thank you." Grant inclined her head slightly. Professional acknowledgement, no commentary, no visible satisfaction, just procedural alignment. The bystanders murmured softly now, the earlier tension dissolving into quiet recognition that something significant had just unfolded. A man near the front of the gathering spoke quietly to the woman beside him. "They held her here for nothing." The woman shook her head slightly. "Not nothing." She gestured subtly toward the federal vehicles. "Something bigger." The lead agent addressed Brooks once more. "For transparency, this interaction will be included in a standard procedural review." The phrasing remained neutral, but unmistakably formal. Brooks nodded once. "I understand." Grant's posture shifted slightly, her stance now fully neutral, neither reinforcing nor contradicting the earlier direction of the stop. The younger officer quietly stepped back toward his patrol vehicle, the subtle repositioning communicating adjustment without instruction. Authority had recalibrated. The lead agent turned toward Naomi's vehicle. "Ms. Carter, we are ready when you are." Naomi inclined her head once. "Understood." She started the engine. The Porsche responded with its characteristic smooth ignition tone-controlled power contained within precise engineering. The sound contrasted sharply with the earlier tension that had surrounded the vehicle. Brooks stepped back, allowing space. The gesture did not go unnoticed by the crowd. Physical distance often communicated what words did not. Grant watched quietly as Naomi adjusted the steering wheel, slightly preparing to re-enter the roadway once clearance was provided. The federal agent spoke again into his communication device. "Clear path." The second SUV shifted slightly, creating a controlled opening through which Naomi could proceed. No urgency, no spectacle, only quiet, procedural continuity. The crowd parted subtly along the sidewalk. Phones lowered slowly. Narratives already forming for later discussion. Brooks stood beside Grant, both observing as Naomi guided the Porsche forward a few feet, before pausing once more as the lead agent approached her driver's side window briefly. Their conversation remained inaudible to the crowd. Short, professional. Then the agent stepped back. A small nod. Acknowledgement complete. Naomi eased the vehicle forward. The Porsche moved smoothly between the positioned federal vehicles before continuing down the street, disappearing gradually beyond the intersection. The flashing patrol lights remained behind, reflections fading slowly from the polished storefront windows. The lead agent turned back toward Brooks. "We will follow up regarding documentation submission." Brooks nodded. "Yes." The agent inclined his head slightly, then returned toward the SUV. One by one, the federal vehicles powered on, engines quiet, movements precise. Within moments, the black SUVs departed the same way they had arrived: coordinated, controlled, unambiguous. The street began returning to its normal rhythm. Pedestrians resumed walking. Traffic resumed flowing. Phones lowered. But the moment did not disappear. Moments like this rarely did. Grant exhaled slowly. The younger officer opened his patrol car door without speaking. Brooks remained still for a moment longer, watching the space where the Porsche had disappeared. Authority often felt absolute until context revealed its limits. The red and blue lights continued flashing, but their meaning had changed. What had begun as certainty had ended as documentation, and documentation often lasted longer than assumption. By the time the street returned to its usual rhythm, the moment had already begun, traveling far beyond the city block where it occurred. Several of the bystanders who had recorded the encounter uploaded their footage within minutes. The clips varied in angle clarity and commentary, but together they told a consistent story, a routine stop that escalated unnecessarily. A calm black woman questioned repeatedly about her right to own an expensive vehicle, and the sudden arrival of federal agents that shifted the entire atmosphere. The narrative spread quickly. Chicago was no stranger to public debate regarding profiling, but moments captured on video often carried a different weight than written reports or official statements. Visual evidence removed interpretation. It showed tone, posture, timing, the details people felt rather than merely read. Within hours, multiple clips began circulating across social platforms. Some viewers focused on the visible escalation: 3 patrol vehicles surrounding a single motorist. Others pointed out the repeated implications voiced loudly enough for bystanders to hear. "This doesn't look like verification," one widely shared comment read. "This looks like assumption." Another post highlighted Naomi's composure throughout the encounter. She never raised her voice once. She didn't argue. She just stood there while being treated like a suspect. Perspective varied, but the emotional pattern remained consistent. Public discomfort, public questioning, public reflection. At the Chicago Police Department, the situation did not go unnoticed. Internal supervisors had already received notification of federal involvement in the encounter. While the Department of Justice had not publicly issued any formal statement regarding Naomi Carter's cooperation in the broader financial investigation, the appearance of DOJ agents at the scene had created enough visibility to prompt procedural review. Documentation requests began moving through internal channels: body camera footage, dispatch records, timeline reconstruction. Officer Daniel Brooks submitted his report before the end of his shift. His language remained technical, structured, carefully aligned with procedural phrasing. Traffic observation, verification of documentation, officer safety considerations. Nothing in the report captured tone. Nothing captured implication. Nothing captured the quiet escalation visible in the videos now circulating publicly. Officer Melissa Grant also completed her report. Her language was precise, concise, observational, professional. She did not editorialize. She did not speculate. But her timeline included details difficult to ignore. All documentation provided by Naomi Carter matched registration data. VIN confirmed prior to extended questioning. Additional verification steps exceeded standard roadside procedure. Facts presented neutrally often spoke louder than commentary. By the following morning, the footage had reached local media desks. A short segment appeared during an early news broadcast, carefully worded to avoid compromising any federal investigation, but acknowledging the public interest generated by the interaction. A video circulating online shows a Chicago traffic stop that escalated before federal authorities intervened. Officials have not released full details, but sources confirm the individual involved was cooperating in an unrelated federal matter. The phrasing was cautious, measured, but unmistakable. Context had changed. Naomi Carter's name was not initially disclosed publicly. Privacy considerations remained in place due to the ongoing DOJ investigation, but those familiar with her work in financial analytics quickly recognized her. Industry colleagues began contacting her quietly, not out of curiosity, out of concern, out of support. One message read simply, "You handled that with remarkable composure." Another, "Let me know if you need legal media protection." Naomi responded politely, briefly, professionally. Her focus remained where it had always been, on the work, on the investigation, on ensuring the larger case proceeded without disruption. Public attention did not distract her. It never had. Meanwhile, within the department, Brooks's supervisors initiated a standard internal review process, not a public disciplinary announcement, not an immediate conclusion, but a formal evaluation, procedure, documentation, assessment of judgment, assessment of proportional response, assessment of whether escalation aligned with departmental expectations. Brooks attended the preliminary review meeting 2 days later. The conversation remained professional, direct, focused on sequence rather than motive, why additional units were requested, why questioning extended beyond vehicle verification, why the stop continued after initial documentation aligned. Brooks answered carefully, within procedural language, within structural justification. But context had changed, and context influenced interpretation. Grant was also asked to provide clarification. Her answers remained consistent with her report. Measured, precise, unemotional, professional. The review process would take time. Internal assessments rarely concluded quickly, but the existence of review itself communicated recognition that something within the interaction warranted examination. Public commentary continued evolving online. Some viewers emphasized the broader issue of assumption tied to appearance. Others focused on the professionalism Naomi displayed throughout the encounter. Some debated procedural boundaries. Others simply expressed relief that the situation had resolved without physical escalation. Moments like this often resonated beyond the individuals directly involved. They invited larger conversations, questions about perception, questions about bias, questions about how quickly authority could interpret unfamiliar success as irregularity. Naomi did not engage publicly with the discussion. Her role remained defined by the federal investigation she had agreed to support months earlier. Her focus remained unchanged. But the encounter had created ripple effects beyond the immediate street. Ripples within the department, ripples within public dialogue, ripples within professional circles observing how quickly narrative could form and how quickly narrative could be corrected. Somewhere within the city, individuals who had experienced similar moments watched the footage quietly, recognizing familiar tension, recognizing familiar restraint, recognizing familiar composure required in situations where dignity was tested without cause. The street where the stop occurred returned fully to normal within hours. Traffic flowed. Pedestrians moved without hesitation. No visible trace remained of the flashing lights or gathered crowd. But documentation remained. Video remained. Memory remained. And in many cases, awareness remained. In the days that followed, the story did not disappear. It evolved. Clips from the encounter continued circulating across social media, often accompanied by commentary that extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The footage had become more than a moment, it had become a mirror, reflecting conversations many people had been having quietly for years. The video's most replayed segment was not the arrival of the Department of Justice vehicles. It was Naomi Carter, standing calmly beside the Porsche, while questions drifted further and further from the boundaries of a traffic stop. Her composure had become symbolic, not of wealth, not of status, but of restraint. Restraint in the face of assumption, restraint in the face of implication, restraint in the face of public scrutiny. For many viewers, that restraint felt familiar. Legal analysts began weighing in, cautiously emphasizing the importance of procedural clarity during traffic stops involving high-value assets. Former prosecutors appeared on panel discussions carefully distinguishing between legitimate verification and extended investigative behavior without clearly articulated cause. Language mattered. Framing mattered. Tone mattered, even when intentions were disputed. Within the Department of Justice, Naomi's consultation work continued uninterrupted. The investigation she had been assisting remained complex, involving multi-state shell entities designed to obscure transaction pathways across layered financial structures. Her analytical models had already helped identify several previously undetected transaction loops. The scale of the operation reinforced why discretion had originally been prioritized. But the unexpected public visibility now created an additional dimension: awareness. Several advocacy organizations referenced the footage in broader discussions about perception-based escalation. Not as a singular case study, but as part of a recurring pattern that many individuals recognized from personal experience. Former federal judge Patricia Ellison commented during a legal forum, "Procedural authority carries responsibility. The presence of documentation should narrow suspicion, not expand it." The statement was not directed at any individual officer, but its implication resonated widely. Within professional circles, Naomi received several invitations to speak on topics related to data, ethics, bias, detection, and the role of algorithmic accountability in modern financial systems. Her expertise had always been respected, but now her composure under pressure had added another dimension to her public profile. Still, she remained selective regarding public appearances. Her priority remained the federal case she had committed to supporting. Commitment mattered, focus mattered, purpose mattered. Meanwhile, the internal review concerning Officer Daniel Brooks progressed quietly. The process followed standard departmental structure timeline evaluation. Procedure assessment. Comparative analysis with departmental guidelines. The review was not designed to produce spectacle. It was designed to produce clarity. Grant's observations contributed to the documentation. Her statements remained consistent, professional, measured, objective. She did not assign motive. She described sequence. Facts allowed evaluators to determine whether judgment aligned with expectation. Brooks continued reporting for duty during the review period. Protocol allowed continued assignment pending final determination. But awareness had changed. Colleagues observed quietly. Supervisors documented carefully. Training supervisors noted the importance of reinforcing clarity in threshold determination during roadside interactions. Moments like this often influenced internal training modules, not through public condemnation, through procedural refinement. The video continued accumulating views. Millions now. But its tone had shifted. Early reactions had centered on tension. Later reactions centered on discussion. Dialogue expanded beyond the specifics of the Porsche the stop, or even Naomi Carter herself. The conversation moved toward a broader question. How often did perception shape expectation before evidence had opportunity to speak? Several business leaders publicly expressed support for Naomi's professionalism, emphasizing the importance of ensuring that visible success did not automatically trigger scrutiny disproportionate to circumstance. One comment circulated widely: achievement should not require explanation. The phrase resonated, not because it denied accountability, but because it emphasized fairness in how accountability was applied. Naomi herself remained measured in her response when approached privately for comment. Her statement was brief. Respect should never depend on assumption, nothing more, nothing less. Clarity rarely required length. The Department of Justice case continued advancing quietly, supported by the analytic frameworks Naomi had helped develop. Several subpoenas issued in the following weeks indicated the investigation was progressing effectively. Precision often produced results. Discipline often produced outcomes. The street where the stop had occurred returned fully to anonymity. Pedestrians passed without awareness of what had unfolded days earlier. Storefront reflections no longer carried flashing lights. No physical markers remained. But the digital record continued circulating, serving as reminder, serving as reference, serving as catalyst for conversations that extended far beyond one intersection in Chicago. For many viewers, the story reinforced something deeply familiar. Dignity often revealed itself most clearly when challenged unfairly, and calm often carried more strength than confrontation. The moment that began as assumption had ended as reflection, and reflection often created change that no individual interaction alone could accomplish. The conference room overlooking downtown Chicago was quiet when Naomi Carter stepped toward the podium. Floor-to-ceiling glass reflected the skyline behind her steel structures, rising with quiet authority, built over decades by individuals who understood that progress rarely happened all at once. Progress accumulated slowly, often carried forward by people who refused to accept limitation imposed by assumption. The room was filled with journalists, legal analysts, policy observers, and representatives from several financial institutions following the developments of the federal investigation. Naomi had initially declined multiple interview requests. She had not sought public attention. She had not attempted to shape narrative. But the moment captured on that city street had already begun influencing conversations far beyond the circumstances of the stop itself. And sometimes silence left too much space for misinterpretation. Her statement would not address specific details of the federal investigation. Confidentiality remained essential, but broader reflection carried value. She rested her hands lightly on the podium, her posture calm, her expression composed. The room gradually fell silent. No dramatic introduction, no theatrical pause, just presence. Measured, intentional. I did not share my experience publicly to assign blame. Naomi began, her voice steady, resonant, without force. I shared it because moments like that do not happen in isolation. Several reporters lowered their pens slightly, listening closely. Naomi continued, "Assumptions are rarely announced when they occur. They are often subtle, quiet, sometimes even unintended." Her eyes moved briefly across the room. But subtle does not mean harmless. The words settled gently, but firmly. Every individual deserves the opportunity to be evaluated based on evidence, not expectation. A camera shutter clicked softly somewhere near the back of the room. Naomi paused briefly. Professional accountability exists for a reason. It protects institutions. It protects communities. It protects trust. She did not raise her voice. She did not dramatize the moment. She did not exaggerate. Clarity rarely required amplification. I believe most individuals who choose public service do so with sincere intention, she continued. But intention does not remove responsibility. Several heads nodded subtly among the observers. The purpose of reflection is not punishment. It is improvement. Her phrasing remained careful, balanced, focused on principle rather than individual conflict. When evidence is presented, it should narrow uncertainty, not expand suspicion. The sentence resonated with particular clarity. Precision mattered. Language mattered. Perspective mattered. Naomi's gaze remained steady. Innovation has changed how we evaluate financial systems. It has changed how we detect irregular patterns. A faint pause. Perhaps it is time we apply the same rigor to how we evaluate our assumptions. The room remained silent. Attentive. Engaged. No raised voices. No confrontational tone. Just measured reflection delivered with calm conviction. I did not succeed because barriers did not exist, Naomi said. I succeeded because barriers did not define the limits of my effort. The words landed with quiet weight. Some reporters paused their writing momentarily. Absorbing. Processing. Respecting the stillness between statements. Respect should never require proof of worthiness. Naomi continued. It should be the starting point. Her closing words arrived without emphasis, without performance, without spectacle. Just clarity. When dignity is preserved, trust becomes possible. A final pause. Then, and when trust becomes possible, progress follows. No applause erupted immediately, not out of indifference, out of recognition that the message extended beyond the event that had brought them together. Naomi stepped away from the podium quietly. No dramatic exit, no lingering gesture, just continuation. Outside, the city moved as it always had, traffic flowing, pedestrians navigating familiar sidewalks, life continuing without announcement. But the conversation sparked by one moment had now reached audiences far beyond that street. Some viewers saw the story as validation of experiences they had never publicly shared. Others saw it as an opportunity to reconsider how quickly perception could form. Some saw it as a reminder that professionalism and dignity often existed quietly, even when challenged publicly. Officer Daniel Brooks's internal review would eventually conclude. Departments would continue refining training protocols. Institutions would continue balancing authority with accountability. And individuals across countless professions would continue navigating assumptions both visible and unseen. But one truth remained constant. Character revealed itself most clearly under pressure, not through volume, not through force, but through steadiness, through clarity, through refusal to allow circumstance to define identity. Naomi Carter never intended to become a public example. She intended only to do her work well, to contribute expertise where needed, to move forward with purpose. But sometimes the moments individuals do not choose become the moments that create change. And sometimes the quiet refusal to accept unfair definition becomes its own form of leadership.